It all began on an unremarkable morning in early spring, the kind of day where the air carries just a hint of warmth after weeks of cold. I had just finished washing my car, a deep metallic blue coupe that I had saved for years to afford. To me. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of independence, of effort, of pride in something earned with my own hands. It gleamed in the driveway, sunlight reflecting off its polished surface, drawing quiet admiration from neighbors who passed by. But not everyone saw it that way. The president of the Homeowners Association, a man named Gerald, lived just 3 houses down. He was the kind of person who wore his authority like armor, always armed with his clipboard and a perpetual scowl. Gerald believed the HOA was not simply a governing body, but a personal kingdom, and he its self-appointed monarch. His word was law, at least in his mind, and dissent was treated as heresy. That morning, as I admired the car's shine, Gerald appeared at the edge of my property. His eyes narrowed, his lips pursed, his entire posture radiating disapproval. He saw not a car but a violation, a disruption of the beige, bland conformity he demanded of the neighborhood. My blue coupe stood out against the sea of muted sedans and SUVs that filled the driveways, and Gerald despised it. The notice came later that day, slipped into my mailbox with an officious flourish. It was written in sharp, formal language, stamped, with the HOA's emblem, and signed with Gerald's looping script. The message was absurd yet clear. My car was non-compliant with the HOA's aesthetic guidelines, its color deemed too flashy and disruptive. Unless I repainted it in an approved neutral tone, specifically beige, I would face daily fines until I complied. At first, I thought it must be a joke. Who demands someone repaint a car simply because it's blue? But Gerald was serious. And when I looked deeper into the HOA bylaws, I discovered a vague clause about vehicles and property exteriors not disrupting the community aesthetic. It was a loophole broad enough for Gerald to wield however he pleased. The fines started small, $25 a day, but they added up quickly. Within 2 weeks, I owed hundreds of dollars. Letters piled up, each one more threatening than the last, promising legal action if I didn't bring my vehicle into compliance. Gerald strutted past my driveway daily, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes as if cataloging my defiance. I tried reasoning with the board, but Gerald's influence ran deep. He had stacked the committee with his loyalists, people too afraid to challenge his authority or too indifferent to care. Every appeal I filed was denied, every argument dismissed. It became clear this wasn't about the car, it was about control. Gerald wanted to prove a point, to remind the neighborhood that his power was absolute. But what he didn't realize was that his obsession had awakened something in me as well. I wasn't the type to roll over, to surrender to ridiculous demands. The more he pushed, the more determined I became to resist. Neighbors began to take notice. Some whispered words of support as they passed by, careful not to draw Gerald's ire. Others kept their distance, wary of being associated with me. But even in their silence, I could sense their frustration with him. Gerald had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, writing people up for slightly overgrown lawns, demanding flower beds be replanted in approved colors, even fining someone for hanging a holiday wreath before the official start of the season. My car had simply become his latest target. Still, the pressure mounted. The fines continued, and Gerald escalated by threatening to tow the vehicle if I didn't comply. His arrogance seemed boundless, his hunger for control insatiable. I knew then that this wasn't just about my car. It was about standing up to a bully who had gone unchecked for far too long. That was the moment I began to think not just about resisting, but about revenge. Not the petty kind, not vandalism or shouting matches, but something bigger. Something that would expose Gerald for what he truly was, a tyrant hiding behind bylaws and bureaucracy. I wanted to turn his obsession with control into his undoing. The idea came slowly, like a seed planted in frustration that grew stronger with each passing day. I realized that if Gerald wanted to make an example of me, I could turn the tables and make an example of him. All I needed was patience, strategy, and the willingness to fight fire with fire. So I began to plan. And as spring turned to summer, with fines piling higher and Gerald's glares growing sharper, I knew the battle lines were drawn. He wanted my car beige. But what he was going to get instead was a lesson he and the entire neighborhood would never forget. The fines kept rolling in, each one another small dagger aimed at my wallet and patience. Gerald sent notices with the same smug satisfaction he'd always shown when flexing HOA muscle, pleading letters, warnings, escalation threats, until the daily charge became a steady, bitter rhythm. The neighborhood murmured, some pitied, most avoided, but a few quietly admired the way I refused to be erased into a bland anonymity of beige. Patience and strategy became my allies. I refused to react emotionally. Instead, I cataloged every notice, every photo Gerald took of the car, every time his minions circled past my driveway. I kept logs of when the fines hit my account, I saved emails, and I recorded the dates of every face-to-face shove, every time saving of his clipboard. I wanted a complete paper trail, because the smallest detail could become the seed of a larger truth. The more meticulous I was, the more leverage I would build. I also began to listen. There is a unique kind of intelligence that comes from paying attention to how someone enforces authority, what they care about, what they hide, where their ego bleeds most. Gerald loved optics. He loved rules mainly when they suited his image. He'd spoken proudly at meetings about neighborhood cohesion, but what he truly loved was the power to point and have people move. He loved being admired, even feared. That insight guided my thinking. If I could expose that hunger for image, if I could make his need for control visible to the people whose signatures and votes sustained him, then his kingdom would be vulnerable. So I started building quiet alliances. Not grand proclamations or dramatic rallies, but a series of conversations. A coffee here, a casual wave there, an exchange about neighborhood kids' soccer schedules, the usual small talk that loosens others' guard. From those small interactions, stories surfaced. A retired teacher who had been fined for painting her mailbox an unapproved color. A young couple threatened for placing a grill on a side porch. A landscaper who'd been harassed over gravel that didn't match the community palette. Everyone had a grievance. Most had sworn never to speak up because Gerald made it socially costly. But when they saw the car, fines were absurd and consistent. A few agreed to quietly gather information, to save emails, to keep receipts. Evidence, after all, needed witnesses. Parallel to gathering allies, I began designing what would become the centerpiece of my plan, a campaign of aesthetic, subversion so precise it would expose Gerald for what he was, an authoritarian obsessed with conformity. I didn't want to flout the rules in a way that made me look petulant. I wanted to show the community that his interpretations of the bylaws were arbitrary and personal. The best way to do that would be to highlight the hypocrisy. Houses painted non-standard colors that had never been fined, trucks with logos, sports decals, and bumper stickers that went untouched, neighbors with restored vintage cars left gleaming in driveways. Yet my fantastically ordinary blue coupe received relentless attention. Next came the legal research. I wasn't reckless. I hired a real estate attorney on a retainer, the kind of professional who didn't bat an eyelash at HOA disputes and knew how to turn village paranoia into legal culpability. She dissected the bylaws, found vagueness where Gerald had relied on vagueness, and identified procedures Gerald had bulldozed through without proper votes. That discovery was crucial. The HOA had a history of informal enforcement, phone calls, off-record meetings, and unilateral fines. precisely the sort of behavior a court or a regulatory body would frown upon. If we could show selective enforcement and procedural irregularities, Gerald's fines would look less like community oversight and more like personal abuse of power. Armed with legal support and a quiet coalition, I shifted to public optics. There is an art to exposing a bully without making oneself appear as the bully's mirror image. I began to host small, tasteful neighborhood events, potlucks on a Saturday afternoon, a lawnmower tune-up swap, a local mechanic offering free brake checks one weekend. These were normal, friendly acts, but they served two purposes. They re-knit community ties that Gerald had frayed through fear, and they gave me an opportunity to mention, casually, that everyone should keep copies of notices from the HOA, that bureaucratic transparency is important, that people have rights, no chants, no signs, just normalcy with an undercurrent of civic competence. Meanwhile, I refused to pay the fines. It was not a theatrical stance. It was a calculated risk. Paying would legitimize the punishment. Refusing opened the door to enforcement actions Gerald didn't want to pursue in the light, liens, towing, or worse, petty court battles. He threatened each of those, but when the HOA tried to escalate, they discovered gaps in their record-keeping, missing votes authorizing fines, absent board minutes, and irregularities in the ledger. My attorney ensured that every time the HOA threatened action, we were ready to counter with documentation demonstrating that any enforcement had been procedurally flawed. Gerald's tone shifted from smug certainty to guarded irritation. For the first time, his authority had a paper trail that contradicted his narrative. While the bureaucratic pressure eased in some ways, the personal pressure escalated. Gerald's stares grew more malignant, cars lingered in front of my home longer, and anonymous notes appeared on the windshield. I installed a dash cam and a small outdoor camera, discreet enough not to shout surveillance, but effective at recording the persistent harassment. The footage showed more than just Gerald's visits: neighbors' cars idling with men in HOA uniforms, a van that stopped by daily as though making a habit of checking my driveway. Each recording added to the story we were building. This was not administration. It was a campaign. With the coalition and evidence mounting, I decided it was time to change the narrative publicly. I worked with a graphic designer friend to create a tasteful, informative pamphlet that explained the HOA process, homeowners' rights, and what to do if you receive an unjust fine. We distributed it quietly to mailboxes, labeled as a residence. Resources guide. No mention of my car, no personal attacks, just helpful facts. The pamphlet did two things. It empowered neighbors to keep records, and it humanized me. I was no longer the blue car in the driveway. I was a neighbor trying to protect the community from overreach. Then, the turning point came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a scheduled board meeting where Gerald planned his next round of theatrics. We arrived prepared. Not a mob or a protest, but a room full of calm, organized homeowners, each with a folder of documentation. We sat in the benches where people usually slumped in embarrassment. The meeting opened with Gerald reading his prepared script about community standards and enforcement. Then, one by one, people rose to speak, not with venom, but with evidence. An elderly woman read a letter showing that Gerald had fined her and later rescinded it only after she protested. A contractor presented photos of approved renovations on neighboring streets that would have broken the rules Gerald insisted upon. Our attorney quietly passed copies of the HOA's bylaws with highlighted sections showing where Gerald had skipped required member votes. The effect was seismic. Gerald, who had thrived on the quiet compliance of others, fumbled. His carefully orchestrated threats sounded hollow when the room filled with corroborating stories. The board could no longer claim ignorance. They were either complicit or incompetent. Neither option looked good. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice but to place a temporary stay on any further fines while they reviewed their procedures. Gerald's posture, once erect with certainty, slumped. It wasn't a knockout blow. It wasn't meant to be, but it was a pivot. The neighborhood now had eyes, records, and most importantly, each other. Gerald had asked for Beige, demanded submission, and instead had catalyzed a community to ask for accountability. My blue coupe remained in the driveway unchanged, and the small cloud of fines began to evaporate under the scrutiny we had gathered. As summer rolled on, the drama simmered. Gerald continued to grumble, but with less confidence. Neighbors stopped lowering their eyes when he passed. Kids rode their bikes with less caution, laughing louder. My revenge had not yet been theatrical or vindictive, just steady, organized, and inevitable. The real climax would come later when the evidence we had collected and the alliances we had built converged in a way that would expose him far beyond a petty dispute over color. And through it all, the blue car sat in the sun, gleaming a small, stubborn beacon of refusal. Gerald wanted it beige. He wanted uniformity, fear, and control. What he was getting instead was the beginning of the end of his little kingdom. The shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere was subtle but undeniable. Where once Gerald's word had been final, whispered about in kitchens and tolerated in silence, now there was tension. People began to notice details they had ignored before. The way Gerald cut lines during meetings, the selective enforcement of rules, the smug authority he wielded like a weapon. My car was still there, bright and unchanged, but it was no longer just a car. It had become a symbol, quiet, stubborn proof that Gerald's system of control was fallible. Yet Gerald was not a man to retreat quietly. His pride was wounded, and wounded pride is often more dangerous than unchecked power. He doubled down, adopting new strategies. The notices grew more dramatic, printed in bold letters and left conspicuously on my windshield. The HOA newsletter, once a bland sheet of meeting dates and landscaping reminders, now contained veiled references to rogue homeowners and threats to community harmony. Everyone knew who those words were meant for. Gerald believed that public shaming would turn the tide, that the neighbors who had cautiously begun to question him would scatter under the weight of collective judgment. But the opposite happened. Instead of isolating me, Gerald's campaign exposed his pettiness. People rolled their eyes at the dramatic language in the newsletters, quietly mocking his choice of words. Some even slipped copies of old newsletters into my mailbox with sarcastic notes pointing out how far his tone had shifted from calm leadership to paranoia. It wasn't just me against Gerald anymore. It was Gerald against the very perception of fairness. I remained quiet, methodical, and deliberate. Every newsletter, every notice, every exaggerated threat was added to the growing file I kept with my attorney. The thicker the file became, the more confident I felt that Gerald's recklessness would be his undoing. But Gerald was desperate. When shaming didn't work, he moved to intimidation. Cars idled longer in front of my home. The HOA's so-called compliance team began taking photos not only of my car but also of my lawn, my trash bins, even the plants near my porch. They sent me warnings about potential violations, each one vague, each one laughably flimsy. It was obvious they were trying to overwhelm me, to bury me in so much petty harassment that I would give up and comply. I refused. Instead, I leaned harder into the community I had quietly built. I invited neighbors over more often, not for strategy meetings, but for genuine moments of normalcy. Barbecues, movie nights, yard sales. The stronger our bonds grew, the harder it became for Gerald to isolate me. In fact, several neighbors began sharing their own warning letters with me, realizing they weren't alone. We compared them side by side, and the pattern was unmistakable. Gerald was manufacturing violations to maintain control. It wasn't long before Gerald overplayed his hand. One morning, I walked outside to find that my car had been marked with a fluorescent orange sticker, declaring it non-compliant and threatening immediate towing if not repainted or removed within 72 hours. The sight of it was almost laughable, this bright, childish sticker plastered on the window of a perfectly legal, well-maintained vehicle. Neighbors gathered around to gawk, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others snapping photos with their phones. Gerald had wanted humiliation, but instead, he had created a spectacle. I peeled the sticker off carefully, saved it, and added it to my file. Then I made a deliberate choice. I left the adhesive residue on the glass for a few days, visible proof of Gerald's stunt. Each time a neighbor walked past, they asked about it, and I explained the truth calmly, without exaggeration. I didn't need to embellish. Gerald's behavior spoke louder than anything I could say. Meanwhile, the legal gears were turning. My attorney drafted formal letters demanding the cessation of selective enforcement, citing specific examples backed by photos and testimonials. We reminded the board of their fiduciary duty, their obligation to fairness, and the liability they incurred by allowing Gerald to operate unchecked. The letters were delivered with precision, each one a reminder that Gerald was not just fighting me, he was fighting a mounting case that could cost the HOA dearly in court. Still, Gerald pressed on, and his obsession became his greatest weakness. He began personally patrolling the neighborhood more frequently, clipboard in hand, scowling at children playing too close to sidewalks, scribbling notes about parked bicycles, snapping photos of garden gnomes and porch swings. What he didn't realize was that the more visible his obsession became, the more ridiculous he looked. People began recording him in secret, posting videos online under humorous captions. Gerald thought he was instilling fear, but he had become a caricature, a walking embodiment of HOA tyranny. The moment of escalation came during another board meeting. Gerald, red-faced and jittery, launched into a tirade about threats to community cohesion. He waved photos of my car as though they were evidence of criminal activity, his voice cracking as he demanded immediate board approval for towing. But this time, the board hesitated. Some members glanced uncomfortably at one another, others avoided his gaze entirely. They had seen the evidence we'd gathered, felt the rising tension in the community, and recognized the risk of standing blindly behind him. The room was quiet when one of the board members finally spoke. Not in my defense, not directly against Gerald, but with a simple suggestion: we need to review the bylaws more carefully before proceeding. It was a small statement, but it carried enormous weight. For the first time, Gerald had been openly challenged in his own arena. His face hardened, his hands trembled, but he could do nothing but agree. That night, I knew the tide had fully turned. Gerald still had his title, his clipboard, and his temper, but his control was slipping. The board was no longer unquestioningly loyal. The community was no longer quietly obedient. And my car, parked in the same spot, still gleamed defiantly, untouched, unpainted, and untowed. But I wasn't finished. Patience had been my greatest weapon so far, but now it was time to push further. The evidence file was thick, the neighbors were emboldened, and Gerald's credibility was eroding. What came next would not just protect me, it would expose him so completely that he could never recover his grip on the neighborhood again. The stage was set. The real revenge was about to begin. The balance of power in the neighborhood was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Gerald still carried himself with the arrogance of a man in charge, but the cracks in his control were widening. Where once his words had silenced a room, now they were met with sideways glances, suppressed smirks, or outright defiance. His reign was no longer absolute. My car, still bold and blue, became something more than a target of Gerald's obsession. It became a landmark, a rallying point for quiet resistance. Neighbors began to walk by a little slower, offering subtle nods or whispered words of encouragement. Kids rode their bikes in loops around it, laughing and daring one another to park their scooters near it, as if proximity to the car was a badge of rebellion. The vehicle Gerald wanted erased from sight was now the most visible emblem of defiance. Against him, But Gerald was not the type to admit defeat. His pride would not allow him to retreat gracefully, and his paranoia drove him to dig in deeper. He expanded his reach, demanding stricter enforcement of every vague clause in the HOA rulebook. Trash bins were to be hidden within minutes of collection, lawns trimmed with military precision, holiday decorations stripped down the day after the season ended. Each week brought new notices, new threats, new fines, and each one brought more frustration, not just for me, but for everyone. Gerald's campaign against my car had spilled over into the entire neighborhood, dragging everyone into his obsession. Soon I wasn't the only one keeping files and records. Neighbors began documenting their own warnings, their own petty infractions, their own encounters with Gerald. A quiet network formed, and I became its center. We traded stories over coffee, swapped photos at backyard gatherings, and compiled a growing archive of Gerald's missteps. Some of it was laughable, a warning issued over a child's chalk drawing. On a sidewalk, another for a garden gnome in violation of aesthetic guidelines. But some of it was serious. Threats of liens on homes, escalating fines, intimidation tactics that bordered on harassment. The file grew thicker by the week, and I could sense Gerald's grip slipping. The more he tightened his fist, the more people slipped through his fingers. It was around this time that my attorney suggested something bigger, a collective challenge. The law was clear. Selective enforcement and abuse of power by an HOA could lead to serious legal consequences. And with the evidence we had, it wasn't just possible to fight back. It was possible to dismantle Gerald's stranglehold entirely. But timing was everything. We couldn't simply file a lawsuit out of the blue. It would be costly, drawn out, and risk fracturing the neighborhood further. Instead, we decided to wait for the perfect moment, the kind of overreach that would serve as the final straw. Gerald was reckless enough to give us that opening. All we had to do was watch and be ready. And then, as if on cue, it happened. The neighborhood's summer block party had always been a tradition, an annual gathering where families came together. Grills smoked, kids played games, and for one day, the HOA rules seemed to soften. But this year, Gerald declared the event canceled. His reasoning was absurd. Gatherings of that size, he claimed, would cause parking disruptions and diminish property values. The neighborhood was outraged. Even those who had once stayed neutral felt the sting of his pettiness. The block party wasn't just fun, it was a tradition, a marker of community. Canceling it was an attack on the very spirit of the neighborhood. That was when the whispers turned into action. A group of neighbors approached me, their frustration boiling over. They wanted to hold the block party anyway, off the books, outside. The HOA's control on private property where Gerald's reach couldn't touch. The idea was bold, risky, and exactly the kind of opportunity I had been waiting for. So we planned in secret. Driveways and backyards became meeting spots. Text threads buzzed late into the night, and tasks were divided quietly among us. Gerald, ever suspicious, prowled the streets with his clipboard, but he never caught wind of the plans. By the time the day arrived, every detail was in place. The block party was held on the largest cul-de-sac in the neighborhood, far enough from Gerald's home that he couldn't claim it was obstructing his property. Tents went up, grills roared, music played, and laughter filled the air. My car sat proudly at the entrance, not hidden, not muted, but gleaming in the sunlight like a beacon of defiance. When Gerald arrived, as everyone knew he would, his fury was almost comical. He stormed in with his clipboard, barking orders, demanding the gathering disperse. But this time, no one obeyed. Parents crossed their arms, children stood their ground, and neighbors simply turned away, continuing to eat, laugh, and celebrate. For the first time in years, Gerald's authority meant nothing. I watched as his face turned red, his voice rising higher, his threats growing more desperate. And then I saw the exact moment he crossed the line. In his rage, Gerald shoved past a group of kids, nearly knocking one to the ground, and screamed that the HOA would own every house in this neighborhood if people didn't comply. Phones were raised instantly, cameras rolling, every word and gesture captured. That was the final straw. The videos spread like wildfire, first through the neighborhood, then beyond. Within days, clips of Gerald's meltdown were posted online. Viewed thousands of times, shared with captions mocking the HOA tyrant. The man who had once commanded fear was now an internet punchline, his reputation in tatters. And for me, the evidence file was now complete. We had the bylaws, the fines, the selective enforcement, the intimidation, and now undeniable proof of misconduct. Gerald hadn't just lost the respect of the neighborhood. He had handed us the ammunition for his downfall. As I sat in my driveway that evening, the laughter from the block party still echoing down the street, I looked at my car and smiled. Gerald had demanded it be beige, but it had become the brightest color of all, the color of rebellion, of defiance, of justice about to be served. The final act was ready. The revenge was about to unfold. By the time the block party footage went viral in our little town, the dynamic had shifted from simmering resentment to a full-blown movement. The videos of Gerald losing his composure circulated on neighborhood chat groups, then on community Facebook pages, and finally on local news feeds. People from other streets messaged their solidarity. Neighboring HOAs sent notes of concern about overzealous leadership. What had started as one man's obsession over a car's color had turned into an exposé of small-town authoritarianism, and the fallout was faster and fiercer than anyone predicted. The board could no longer ignore the storm. Members who had once deferred to Gerald's decisions now faced questions from homeowners who wanted answers. Why had decisions been made without votes? Why had fines been levied inconsistently? Why had the board allowed a single individual to escalate petty complaints into harassment? The words fiduciary duty and conflict of interest began to appear in emails and in the stern-sounding letters our attorney drafted. The aura of infallibility that had protected Gerald for years began to crack under scrutiny. Legal action was no longer a hypothetical bargaining chip. It became a coordinated strategy. The group of neighbors who had been quietly organizing met with our attorney to prepare formal complaints. They compiled documentation, copies of all the fines, screenshots of the newsletters, a timeline of Gerald's patrols and notes, witness statements from those who had been shamed or threatened, and records of board meetings that either lacked proper minutes or showed signs of irregular procedure. The goal was not petty revenge, it was accountability, and it required a careful, legally sound approach. At the same time, the community sought remedies that didn't immediately land in court. Petitions calling for a board audit circulated with surprising speed. The local municipality's ombudsman was contacted, and a request was made for a neutral review of the HOA's governance. Local reporters asked for interviews, and though many homeowners preferred to avoid the spotlight, enough agreed to speak on background to make the story credible. Public pressure mounted, and the board, now anxious and defensive, called a special meeting to address the unrest. The meeting was tense. It was the sort of civic moment that either heals communities or divides them beyond repair. Members of the board arrived with prepared statements. Gerald arrived with a defensive posture and a stack of his own documents. Homeowners filled the room to capacity, many clutching copies of the evidence folder. The reading of minutes and motions became a formality smashed against the torrent of testimony and proof that had accumulated. People spoke not to humiliate but to explain how their lives had been impacted by selective enforcement, how their trust had been eroded, and how they wanted the HOA to return to serving the neighborhood rather than terrorizing it. Under pressure, the board agreed to an independent audit and to suspend Gerald's authority pending review. That suspension sounded small, procedural, almost bureaucratic, but it was seismic in practice. An officer who had lurked at the edge of everyone's daily life now had to answer to a system, rather than act unilaterally. The suspension also meant Gerald lost access to HOA funds and the ability to issue fines on his own. For the first time in years, he had to respond to requests rather than initiate them. But that procedural victory did not quell all fear. Gerald reacted with predictable spite. There were angry emails, threats of litigation, and an attempt, clumsy and transparent, to rally a few loyalists who still saw him as their protector against chaos. He attempted to frame the neighborhood's pushback as a smear campaign, insisting that the evidence had been doctored. It was an old playbook. If the facts weren't on his side, attack the faces that presented them. That rhetoric fell flat. The audit, once underway, was comprehensive and meticulous. Independent auditors reviewed bank statements, invoices, and minutes. They interviewed former and current board members. What they found was a catalog of procedural missteps and questionable expenditures that, while not criminal in every case, painted a picture of complacent leadership that allowed one man too much latitude. Among other findings were missing authorization for certain fines, payments routed to vendors without documented bids, and a pattern of enforcement that disproportionately targeted certain homeowners. Public opinion hardened. The HOA could no longer credibly claim neutrality while the audit was ongoing. The municipality issued guidelines for interim governance and suggested immediate reforms. A special election was scheduled to replace the board members who had enabled Gerald's behavior. The notice for that election was like a reset button for the community. It was the first tangible step toward structural change. While the legal and procedural wheels turned, the personal consequences for Gerald intensified. The man who had once enforced rules with a clipped, smug authority now found himself isolated. He lost social standing, invitations, and any pretense of broad support. Where he had relied on fear, he had nothing left but defensiveness. His attempts to sue individual neighbors for defamation were predictably unsuccessful. The documentation and witnesses made such suits expensive to pursue and unlikely to succeed. Law firms began advising him to consider mediation instead of escalation. My own role in this was complicated. I had not set out to topple a person. I had wanted to be left alone with my car. But the strategy we used, evidence, community building, legal accountability, had broader effects. Many neighbors who had previously lived in quiet compliance found a voice. A few people who had been complacent even apologized publicly, admitting that they had been complicit by staying silent. The block felt healthier, more transparent, and better governed. My blue coupe continued to gleam in the driveway, but now it was less a symbol of solitary defiance and more a relic of the moment the neighborhood reclaimed itself. The final blow, in a technical sense, came with the election. New engaged homeowners were elected to the board, people who prioritized maintenance, community events, and fair enforcement over petty policing. They passed immediate reforms, clear protocols for issuing fines, mandatory member votes for any non-routine enforcement, action, and enhanced financial transparency. The auditor's recommendations were adopted. The HOA's budget was reallocated to pay for community improvements rather than legal intimidation campaigns. Gerald retreated. He remained in the neighborhood for a while, but his presence no longer carried the weight it once did. Some days he would sit outside on his porch, quietly watching as life went on around him. There was no dramatic exile, no cinematic showdown, just a slow diminishing of influence, the sort that happens when institutions are reformed and communities reclaim their voice. The revenge I had promised myself had come in layers, not in a single vindictive act. It was procedural and communal and, in some ways, banal. Documentation, legal pressure, civic engagement. The payoff was not merely watching Gerald squirm, though there was satisfaction in that. The payoff was watching the neighborhood rediscover itself, reclaiming the right to be a place governed by fairness rather than fear. Yet even with reforms in place, I knew vigilance would be necessary. Institutions can drift back to old habits, if people let them. The new board pledged transparency. Meetings became more inclusive and regular audits were scheduled. The community had learned an important lesson about complacency and the fragility of neighborhood governance. My car remained blue, bright, and legally parked, precisely where it started. But the true victory was communal. The block had reasserted its values. As autumn began to approach and leaves started to soften the edges of driveways, the neighborhood felt different in the best possible way. People waved without looking over their shoulders. Children played freely. The small daily anxieties stamped by Gerald's tenure began to fade. The process of undoing an entrenched bully had been slow and messy, but it had worked. The revenge had been achieved not by a flashy stunt, but by systemic change, the kind that lasts. The aftermath of Gerald's fall from power unfolded slowly, like the clearing of a storm. At first, there was silence. No more threatening letters tucked into mailboxes. No more fluorescent stickers slapped onto windshields. No more constant presence of a clipboard-wielding enforcer pacing up and down the street. The air felt lighter, though it took weeks for the neighborhood to trust the change was real. The new board wasted no time in proving that their promises were not empty. Meetings became transparent and inclusive, with agendas posted clearly and decisions explained openly. Homeowners were encouraged to speak without fear of reprisal, and attendance soared. The minutes were no longer cryptic documents used to justify unilateral decisions, but genuine records of discussion and collaboration. Rules were still enforced, but now with consistency and fairness. Instead of weaponized bylaws, the community saw guidelines meant to protect property values without suffocating individuality. The reforms extended beyond governance. With Gerald no longer hoarding HOA funds for legal battles and intimidation campaigns, money flowed back into the community. Common areas were cleaned and improved, landscaping was refreshed, and a long-neglected playground was renovated. Neighbors felt proud of their contributions, seeing tangible results for the dues they paid each month. The block itself came alive again. Where once people had hidden behind blinds or avoided gatherings for fear of Gerald's wrath, now they lingered outside, waved across yards, and visited freely. The summer block party returned in full force the following year, larger and brighter than ever. My car was parked at the entrance again, not as a symbol of defiance this time, but as a reminder of how far the community had come. As for Gerald, his presence faded into the background. For months, he sat on his porch in quiet bitterness, watching, as his former subjects carried on without him. The swagger that once defined his walk was gone, replaced by a kind of slumped resignation. He tried a few times to reclaim relevance. Letters written to local newspapers, half-hearted complaints at public meetings, but they fell flat. His credibility was gone, his authority dismantled. Eventually, he put his house up for sale. When the "for sale" sign appeared in his yard, the neighborhood barely reacted. Some people nodded, some whispered, but no one mourned his departure. He left quietly one morning, a moving truck loaded with the remnants of his reign, and by the afternoon, his house was just another property waiting for a new family. His name became a story, a cautionary tale told to newcomers about the dangers of unchecked power in a homeowners association. For me, the closure was quieter. The fight had started with a demand that I paint my car beige, and in the end, that same car still sat in my driveway, bright blue and unbowed. It was not just a victory over one absurd rule, but a lesson in persistence, in the strength of community, and in the way patience could unravel even the most oppressive control. The revenge I had long envisioned had not been about humiliating Gerald. It had been about restoring balance, about proving that no one person should dictate how others live simply out of ego. The funny thing was, after all the dust settled, I found myself caring less about the car and more about what it had sparked. The coupe had become a symbol, but it was only that, a symbol. The true reward was the neighborhood itself, now vibrant, cooperative, and free of fear. We were no longer bound by Gerald's narrow vision of conformity. Lawns bloomed with flowers in different colors. Porches displayed decorations that reflected real personalities, and cars of every shade filled the driveways. Diversity had replaced uniformity, and the neighborhood was better for it. Still, every so often, when I walked outside and saw my car gleaming under the sun, I smiled. It reminded me of the absurdity of Gerald's crusade, of the strength it took to resist, and of the unity it inspired. A car color had started a war, but it had ended with an entire community reclaiming its voice. Years later, the story still floated around whenever new families moved in. At neighborhood barbecues, someone would inevitably point to my driveway and say, "That's the car Gerald wanted painted beige." Laughter would ripple through the crowd, and the newcomers would shake their heads at the absurdity of it all. It became part of our local lore, a reminder of what happens when authority goes unchecked, and what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough. In the end, revenge hadn't been about getting even. It had been about building something better, about transforming frustration into action, and about ensuring that no one could ever weaponize rules against us again. Gerald had demanded my car be beige, but what he got instead was something he never expected: a legacy of resistance, reform, and a neighborhood that thrived without him. And every time I turn the key in that blue coupe, I'm reminded of the simple truth he never understood. Control is fleeting, but community endures.